So we are excited to give you some tools to take with you as you work with families and communities in need. And to do that, we're excited to have with us Dr. Ticola Ross, who is a clinical assistant professor and field education director with the School of Social Work at UNC Charlotte. She's also a licensed clinical social worker with Cano Family Services. She resides in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband and her 6-year-old boy and girl twins. She's currently, as I mentioned, with UNC Charlotte as the clinical assistant professor and field education director. She graduated from NC State University with a bachelor's and master's and PhD in applied and community psychology and a master in social work from UNC Charlotte. Her clinical areas of specialty include identity development, life transitions, self-care, anxiety, depression, and grief and loss. She's a diehard Grey's Anatomy fan and loves audiobooks. I put that in there. She put that on there as like an aside. And we've had a lot of heavy information this morning, so it's nice to have some levity, something to break it up. But as you heard from her resume, her key components, her fields of study and focus are those things that are going to be useful to you working with families in need, addressing those issues, the crises that people are coming in. People are always coming in with crisis. Those crises are a little different now, thanks to COVID. She's doing the work herself as a social worker. So we're excited to have her with us this morning to sort of give you some tools. You've got all the information. Now let's have some tools so that we can reach solutions. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Ticola Ross.
All right, that sounds good. Hopefully everyone can hear me and is doing well. I'm excited to be connected with you all. I did see a Go Niners, so absolutely go Niners. It was just our homecoming this past weekend, so we've been celebrating all week. I'm gonna go ahead and jump us in. Today we'll be talking about building connection through crisis, working with families and communities towards stabilization. So let me go ahead and get us going. Nafia, thank you so much for that lovely intro. That's kind of what I had there. But what you'll see is I always like to share with my family. We are big Marvel fans and growing into the DC comics as well. But that's my family there, my husband and twins when we were on a Disney cruise. And we were able to stay with the Black Panther. And so I always like to just kind of share a little bit about my family. I heard earlier that you all have already been in the chat box, but I wasn't here earlier. And so I don't know where you're from or your area. And so I was wondering if you could just one more time, please put into the chat box a little bit for me, your organization and the population you work with. That'll be helpful for me as I'm providing examples and walking through my presentation, just to kind of know where folks are and kind of just help me along the way. So that would be lovely if you could just pop in the chat box a little bit. Okay. Central Piedmont Community Action, Chatham County. Zooming in from Raleigh, lovely. So let me know a few others are coming in. Okay, so we got some case managers. Orange County, I know where that is. Coastal Community Action, okay. Yes, Blue Ridge, love that area, nice. Okay, now they're really flowing in. Johnson County, I got some family out that way. Verena, I know where that is. Close by, Union County, okay. Anson and Richmond. Lovely. Thank you all for taking the time to do that. Just kind of helps me to figure out where we are. Got some good old Wake County, Sand Hills. Okay, lovely. All right, well, I'm going to keep us rolling as those come in. Thank you again so much. That just kind of helps me to, when I'm thinking about examples or, the populations that you may be working with. So that's very helpful. Oh, ICAP and Iredell, not too far away. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to keep us rolling here today. So let's look at first our learning objectives. So if we're talking about crisis, I think it's important that we define crisis. And so we'll do that. We'll examine working with diverse communities, examine the difference between empathy and sympathy, and then apply a self-care approach. I will say for each of these, I could probably do like a full day seminar, but it's a lot of different information in this one session. So I think I will be talking in more broad general terms, but my goal is to provide just kind of simple information for you to be able to take back and apply, and not necessarily things that are a little more in depth. So that's kind of how I've built the presentation so far. So let's get rolling. So crisis, this is based on the work of Braziler, who looks at crisis in depth and the idea of safety planning and things of that nature. So that's where some of this work comes from. So what is a crisis? And I want you to think to yourself if you've experienced any of these, and did they feel like a crisis? So we've got losing car keys. If you was late to work, maybe it is a crisis for you. The death of a pet or a parent, being fired from your job, a friend's suicide, diagnosis of cancer, graduation from college. And I want to point out, some people may think that's great, but for some people, they're terrified when they graduate from college. And so it may be a crisis for them. Failing out of school, a broken engagement, turning 30, and I kept it on going, 40, 50, etc. I don't know if, for 10 and 20-year-olds, that's a crisis, but as you age, so for some folks, it does become a crisis. A heroin or substance use overdose. Retirement for some could also still be a crisis if they're used to going and going for several years, and now it's kind of like, what do I do? A loss of religious faith. The birth of a child could be amazing, but also could cause a lot of stress and angst. A parent or a family member that's using substances. If you see a snake, for me, that is maybe a crisis. Like, oh my gosh, get someone. Confronted by a person wielding a knife. That's probably likely a crisis. A dropped phone call, cell phone in the toilet, maybe for a teenager, or maybe for some of y'all too who are all into the phones. That could really be a crisis. And then maybe a positive pregnancy test. So here, I want you to see the wide range of what a crisis could be. And I think it also just depends on the person. But really, depending on the situation, all of these could be crises. For some of us, maybe not so much, but for others, it just depends. And so we want to be careful from the beginning when we're working with clients, when they come in a state of crisis or angst. And I'm like, some of us may be like, well, if you would have did this, or if you would have followed the plan, this wouldn't be a crisis now, or I don't see it as a crisis, but we want to remember that it's really how they define it. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And I didn't mention, but I'm pretty comfortable. I'll be monitoring the chat box. If you have questions on the way through, I'm okay with pausing to answer any questions that you have or comments as well. So feel free to use chat box in that manner. So let's define crisis a little more. As I was kind of getting at, it's really a subjective term. And so a lot of times really allowing your clients or customers that you work with to define that for themselves, for what a crisis is. But Kaplan does kind of sheer it up a little bit. And so it's an obstacle that is for a time. So that's really important. Like crises, you may meet people that have been in crisis for several years, but it's still really a set time frame where you have an insurmountable by the use of customary methods for problem solving. A period of disorganization ensues and a period of upset during which the most abortive attempts at a solution are made. That's kind of convoluted, so let's break that down a little bit. So it's an obstacle. That means that there's something in the way. There's something in the way that's happening. It's happening for a certain amount of time. And then kind of this idea of that so much is happening that your typical methods for solving the problem aren't working. And so that leads to disorganization, likely upset, a lot of emotion and energy, and everything that you're trying to do to stop this obstacle is not working. So that's kind of the crisis. It's a lot of pieces. It's not just, oh, what's disorganization, or I don't have coping mechanisms. It's all these things kind of wrapped into one that make a really big difference here. So also on my little graphic I have here to kind of understand how a crisis unfolds. The first thing that you have is a precipitating event. So that can be anything. That could be a car crash. That could be the illness of someone. That could be losing your car keys. I think where the biggest thing that we see on if it becomes a crisis for the person is really their perception related to that. If they perceive that their lost car keys is a crisis, then that's going to move them into the next phase of emotional distress, lowered by functioning with their coping mechanisms there. So that's really important, because someone may see, again, that as a crisis, and other folks may say, okay, like I got an extra set of keys here, or I'll call my spouse or someone to come get me. And it's not necessarily a crisis. And so it doesn't move into that space of emotional distress. So I think that perception is really important when we're trying to understand and work with our clients and customers and think, I'm not perceiving this as a crisis, although you are. And so we need to kind of think about their perceptions. And we'll get deeper into that when we talk about empathy in a little bit. So again, kind of the idea that something happens, we perceive it. Is it good or bad? How do we make sense of that? If we perceive that it is overwhelming or an obstacle and there's a lot of disorganization, then likely it's going to move us to some emotional distress. And then lower the functioning of coping is that happens as well, where we kind of really can't think clearly to be able to access some of our coping skills. Okay, so then let's look at the types of crisis. So there are different types that we have likely all experienced. And again, I want to push this idea that we have likely all experienced it, even if it's not specific to our clients or customers, because that allows us to begin to connect with them in a different way. So the first is a developmental crisis. This is normal human growth events that happen. So graduations, birth, marriage, divorce, the death of a parent, or something like that. These are things that at one point in time we will all experience, and those are just developmental crises. So on some level, they are experienced and expected, but they still do happen there. And I do see that one coming in, Felicia. So I'm gonna finish this slide, and then we can I'll take a look at that. So we also have situational crises where there are unexpected events. So car accidents, a job termination, a relationship that you thought would last forever broke up. And so those are just situationals, but they can still send people into a space of crisis. Existential crises are more of those inner conflicts that we tend to have related to purpose, responsibility, freedom. People may be questioning their faith or what's the next right move for them. That can really create a crisis that's internal, but we'll find a lot of times will come out externally with in our environments. And then the last one is the ecosystemic crisis, which we actually are all currently in one right now. It sounds like the prior presentation hit on that. But this involves a group or a community of people experiencing similar conditions. So this could be, for instance, when we think about Flint, Michigan, toxic pollution, how that happened to a specific group of people, but that was a crisis for them. But we're all right now living in a pandemic. And so we are experiencing a crisis and having to kind of react to that. So just be mindful that there are different types of crises that people experience, and likely at one point or another, you will experience it yourself. So I'm going to take just a minute here and read about what Felicia posted. Oh, girl, you talking about them snakes? Yes, that is a crisis. Now, for somebody else, maybe not be, but yeah. Experiencing it. Yeah, so I see you still having some issues about a fear of snakes with phobia. So I would likely just a suggestion, but recommend gradual exposure therapy is usually what it's called. And so you would just start out very slowly with, maybe just imagining in your head or looking at pictures of snakes, and then very slowly over time you get more comfortable with it, and then you would actually move up to maybe like possibly touching it after several weeks. And so that's called gradual exposure therapy. And really, that for any folks listening, that works for a lot of stuff. For any fears that we typically have, it is the idea that if you get exposed to it slowly and over time, it becomes more comfortable. For all of us to possibly think about something you used to have a fear of or things you didn't used to do, but the more you did it, the more comfortable you become. That's really the idea there. So thanks for sharing about that. and good luck. Oh, she says, I can't do that. Felicia, maybe we talk a little later, but I think that's where most people start, is that I can't do that. And then it's a slow process. And then I think, just to make it for some of the clients and customers you work with, I think you've probably had clients that come in and say, I can't do this. I can't get housing. I can't get clean. I can't stay sober, whatever some of those things are. That's typically where we all start, thinking we can't do something. But then with a strategic plan, which you all do your plannings with clients, you can slowly move towards something. So keep the faith around that one. Okay. So I want to talk with you about 6 ways individuals respond in crisis. And it can look different for everybody. It also depends on the environment that they're in. As I walk through these, though, I want you to think about your clientele and think about, what you've seen come into your office, or if you do home visits or when you're out in the community, what have you seen when people are in crisis? And so one way that people respond is with aggression. And it could be physical, but it could also be like, have you ever just had clients come in and be nasty to you? And you're like, I just said hello. What's the problem here? But aggression can be one way that it comes out, and where they're just kind of really intense. Another could be passive aggressive, where they may be doing things that seem kind of nice or passive or indirect, but then also doing things that can be aggressive. An example of that may be you've been working with a client, you ask them face to face, how are things going? Can I help you with anything? And the client's like, everything is lovely, it's great, amazing. And then later on, they make a report that you weren't doing your job. That's passive aggressive. In front of you, they were, oh, things are lovely, super passive, everything's okay. But then behind your back, they went and made an aggressive move to try to manipulate the situation. And so with some of these, again, it's really important to remember that these people are acting from a space of crisis, and that's not necessarily who they are in every space. But when we have our backs up against the wall for what we believe is a crisis, it does tend to have us act a little differently here. So the next one could be just really passive. This is likely your client that you're working with, and you ask them, you sit down and you say, what do you want to do with your life? And they're like, I don't know. And you're like, okay, well, tell me what you're interested in. I don't know, nothing. Oh, well, what, like everything that you ask them is just passive. They are just kind of present, and they're really dependent on other people. Or you ask them, what are you into? And they say, I'm into whatever my spouse is into. Or what do you like to do? All I do is think about my kids. And they don't really have a focus on themselves. And so again, I want you to see that as a space of crisis. Because they're in crisis, because they're disorganized and they're overwhelmed, they don't have the skills to access themselves to figure out what they really like, what they really need. And so, just trying to think of that from that space. You also may encounter, with this one, I think it's pretty prevalent, several clients and customers that are just depressed, and you see it on their face, you see it in their body language. Depression can lead to things like they had a meeting and they overslept, and so they, missed the meeting with you. They didn't finish their paperwork because they're not motivated to do so. And so you likely come across some of that a lot too, where they are experiencing depression because of the crisis. The other one here is psychosis, which is really defined as being a break with reality. So folks who are experiencing psychosis tend to think of things that likely aren't true. They may be delusional. They may think that, they live with a celebrity, or that they have direct access to aliens or God or something like that. So it's this idea of a break with reality, which again, depending on the crisis, some of us do begin to hallucinate or have things of that nature depending on the crisis. And so we want to be mindful of that type of mental health concern as well, that is in response to crisis. And last but not least is catatonia. Catatonia is really when people are very subdued. They're kind of just there. It's kind of like if you put your hand in front of their eyes, they're not like, it's nothing. I wouldn't say not a soul there, but just kind of this dazed state that folks are in. But this can also be immediately, especially after crisis. I think about like if there was some type of hurricane or massive accident or something, and you go right on the seen and people are just dazed, that is yet another response to crisis. So these are the 6 different types of ways that people typically respond in crisis. What I think is important for you to take away from this is that I know for me personally, if I'm trying to do my job and I'm trying to do it well, some of these behaviors can be I can be transparent. They can be annoying or they can be challenging, right? If you're trying to work with a client and they cussing you out because they didn't turn in their paperwork, or, you know, you're trying to work with a client and they just keep telling you, I don't know. Or you're working with a client and they're too depressed to really even be engaged in the session that you're having when you're trying to help them. Some of these behaviors can be challenging for you in your role. I know some of you all are case managers and directors. These things can be challenging. But what I found is being able to recognize that it's a response from a crisis allows me to kind of remember that I'm a human being too, and I likely may have been responding the same way if I've been where they were. And so that's just kind of one way for you to think about it, that it's not because anything that you've done or not necessarily anything that they've done. It's just how, as human beings, when we are in a crisis, we respond in different ways that typically aren't always as adaptive. And I'll pause to see if there are any comments or questions around this one. All right, if not, I'll keep us moving. All right, so the last piece that I want to add to the crisis before we begin to transition to working with specific diverse populations is this idea of a crisis, and I have the definition again for you there, this kind of obstacle where you have these methods that you typically use and they're no longer working, and so it creates a crisis. However, a lot of times from a crisis, what ensues is trauma. And you've probably heard a lot about trauma-informed care and that type of thing. And it's really important that we recognize trauma for what it is. So this is a definition that I like to use for trauma. Is when someone experiences something that the brain and the body cannot process. So again, you experience something and the brain and the body cannot process it. So a good example of something that's not trauma-based is if you decided to go to college for school, go to school for 4 years, we expect that you'll graduate. We'll expect that there'll be a lovely graduation day. You'll have on a cap and gown. You'll get your degree. Lovely. Your brain and body can process that because it was expected. I went here for 4 years. I worked hard. I paid a lot of money. My brain is like, I'm ready to graduate. We expect it. My body is happy. Trauma happens when something happens that's unexpected, likely, and your brain and body cannot process it. It may be something like a car accident. You were driving, you had your seatbelt on, you were at the red light, you were paying attention, and still you were in a car accident, for example, possibly. Your brain and body cannot process that because you did everything correctly. You were prepared, you were there, yet something still happened. And so sometimes people do get kind of stuck on the trauma related to a car accident because their brain and body were not expecting that. I hear Carrie talking about I was in a car accident like that. Absolutely. I was in one when I was 4 and it was horrific. I still have marks from it. And, you know, I was just a child, but it was something that happened and my body had to recover from the trauma of that. To go a little deeper, but not too deep, because I'm not sure who's in the audience. But when we talk about things that happen that are horrific, maybe we're talking about sexual assault or something like that, trauma is there too, because again, it's this idea of if you were being violated in any type of way, that's not expected. We think that we should be protected. We think that we deserve better and that people should not be violating us in any kind of way. So when a violation does happen, physical, mental, or emotional, our brain and body stop. They get stuck in time because they're like, I cannot process. I cannot process that someone I loved or someone I trusted has now treated me this way. And there's a lovely book called The Body Keeps the Score. And what I really like about that is sometimes we may be thinking things are just happening emotionally, but it happens in our bodies too. So you want to understand that when we're beginning to treat trauma, we have to think about the brain and body connection. And so what that looks like is if you find yourself getting upset, what happens in your body? Not only just mentally, is your blood boiling? Does your heart rate speed up? Do your hands sweat? Does your shoulders begin to hurt when you're stressed? And so really paying attention to all of that. The other thing that I want to point out, much like how crisis is defined by the person, a trauma is also defined differently by everyone. I'll give you an example. My twins were 6 weeks old, and we had just moved into a new house, and the house caught on fire. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a bit of a crisis here. However, we got out safely. We were luckily insured. And so they came in and rebuilt the whole house. For me, this house fire was not a trauma because of how I perceived it and because of the outcome. But you may unfortunately know other people that have had similar house fires, and it was traumatic for them. Not everything happened well. And so we can't just say, you know, this is trauma and that's not trauma. It really depends on the person. And in a lot of the work that I do, I allow my clients and communities to tell me what's traumatic. And then I go from there instead of me making an assumption about what they do. Oh, yes, it is an excellent book, Sherry. Highly recommend it. It's long, but excellent. And so I think, you know, here, what I'm wanting us to do is just to think about and recognize the role of crisis and trauma in the populations that we work with. They're not just coming to you like things are great and lovely, which you likely know, but sometimes when we get deep into the work, we kind of forget that, but just being mindful that they're coming to you in crisis with a trauma. And then there are these specific responses that people have because they're really trying to protect themselves. So working with diverse communities. So first thing I want to talk about, and I feel like finally, from a more of an academic standpoint, we've made a leap, and I'm hoping that it's extending into practice, where I think for several years, you know, we've just been talking about diversity this, diversity that, diversity this. But I think in the last couple of years, there's really been an expansion in understanding that we need more than diversity in order to really make things happen and make them equitable and for people to really thrive. It's not enough just to have people that look different from different backgrounds in the room. It doesn't mean anything if they don't have any power. And so the Chief Diversity Officer, Robert Sellers, he's out of Michigan State, really emphasized this idea, and him and others as well, but I emphasize this idea of thinking about we need diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I just wanted to pause for a moment and kind of break those down a little bit, because I think that's important when we're working with diverse communities, that we have to acknowledge all of these. So diversity is where everyone is invited to the party. Yay. Like I said, for a while, I think we've been hearing this importance of diversity and having a diverse workforce and things like that. But although everyone was invited to the party, that didn't mean they got to dance and have a good time and have a say. And so now we're thinking about inclusion. Inclusion means that everyone gets to contribute to the playlist. So first you might have been at the party and you was like, this ain't even my kind of music. I don't know what's going on. But now if we're thinking about inclusion, that means they can contribute to the playlist. They have a voice, they have a say. The last piece there is equity. It means that everyone has the opportunity to dance. So before, people might have been at the party, but over in the corner, they weren't playing their music. But now you have an opportunity to make it be known that you're in the room, there's space for you. And that's still very different than just acknowledging diversity. And so I just wanted to, again, kind of keep that in the space, because we want to take that approach when we're working with diverse communities, understanding that everyone that we work with is welcome, and I know you know that already, but how do we make this process inclusive? How do we make sure that they have an opportunity to dance, which means that everyone has space in here and that we can move forward? And I think those are some of the key pieces, just really making sure that people feel welcome, because remember, they're coming to you in crisis. And so one way to eliminate some of that disorganization is for them to feel safe with you. So I want us to look now at the identity wheel here. Likely, if you think about where you fall on this identity wheel, it varies, you know, based on your age or sexual orientation, gender, if you have any military experience, your creed, your education level, your thinking styles. all of this matters. And so I think getting back to the idea of, you're like, how do I work with these diverse communities that look like me, or either they don't look like me? How do I manage all of this? And so the first place to stop and think about is just the idea that every single one of us, if we looked at, I think it was like 88 or 79 of us here now, like if we really thought about how much diversity we're bringing into the space, you have to remember that, and that has to be honored. We can't just say, leave your political ideologies out of this, because likely their political ideologies is going to be what helps them to move forward, or what helps them to make certain decisions. And so it's really about welcoming people into all, allowing all of their identities to come into one single space. Okay, so here, the next one is going to look at power and privilege. And so I think it's one thing, again, kind of, we've been talking about diversity and bring who you are in there, but a lot of the conversations we haven't been having that we need to have are around power and privilege. So I do apologize that the graphic is not as great here, but I couldn't find a better image, but it's a powerful image. And so what you see here in the center is around the power piece. And so typically, this is, of course, out of more Western culture, but if you're identify with these middle pieces, then you're going to have more power. So if you're white, if you have a good education, if you're able-bodied, if you have robust thinking and good mental health, if you're slim, if you own property, if you speak English, if you have a lot of money, if you're a citizen, if you're a cis man, then likely you're going to have more power. And then as you, of course, expand out on the power wheel, it's more likely that you'll be marginalized. And so, what does that mean when we're working with diverse communities? I think you have to think about where you fall. Likely you have some power in some places, and in other places you may be on the outskirts. But either way, you bring that into the space when you're working with clients. And so that brings me to think about this idea of how do we work with diverse communities? We're doing it from a space of intersectionality, which is I wouldn't say a newer term, but it is still newer in terms of like it was out in the 60s. But a newer term here recently that really looks at this idea of people are really complex and they have a lot going on. That's essentially what intersectionality is. And so it's really that people create parts of their identities that's really important for them. So a really good example is, for me, I identify as African-American female. For me, that isn't broken apart. Like it's important that I'm African-American, but it's also important that I'm a female. For me, those two to go together so they intersect. So when you ask me questions about gender or sexism, I can answer those, but they're also going to be coded with my race. But you may, again, meet another African-American female who their, identity or importance, intersectionality is around just their gender and age and not necessarily their race. And so it kind of gets at this idea of making things, as I mentioned, kind of really complex, because we want to go and do good work with diverse communities, but we cannot think that there's one particular model, because if you're looking at the screen here, they're going to have different intersecting identities that you have to identify. And then we have to think about how they experience power and privilege. And then, so that's kind of them. So there's just all they have going on. But then we have to think about ourselves. What intersectionality of identities do you have? And then where do you fall in this power and privilege space? And so really those things are colliding when we're trying to work with diverse communities. I hope that's making sense. So essentially, I just want to kind of keep you going to see where we're building up to. So clients or customers likely come to you in crisis. We know that means they may have a particular response. They may be aggressive. They may have attitudes. They may be disengaged. They're also coming to you with some type of trauma, which means they're stuck in time. It feels like to them that this crisis or trauma is continuing to happen, even though they're not physically having it happen to them again. So that's going to have them to have a particular trauma response. Then they're coming to you with complexity and intersectionality. So kudos to you all, because you're doing a lot of difficult work. And so sometimes if you do have those experiences like I do, where I'm like, whoa, today was heavy, or like, it's just so much going on, we do have to sit back and really acknowledge what our clients and customers are bringing to us. Crisis, trauma, complexity, and intersectionality. And then it's our job to figure out, how do we help them? So I want to point out, how do we work with diverse communities or families here? I'm going to say apply the golden rule, just that simple. I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of very phenomenal approaches around like cultural competence and community action-based work for working with clients. And so those models are very valuable. However, we didn't have that much time to kind of go through those. But I think one that is very simple is really applying the golden rule. And I will see if we can get just a little chatter here in the chat box of why is this such a difficult approach? We live in America, we have tons of resources, yet we still have so many people that are that need assistance. Why is it so difficult sometimes to apply the golden rule when we're working with diverse communities? I'll give you just a minute there to chat. Anyone out there? Okay. Sometimes we lose sight of what we need when we see it in someone else's perspective. Yes, absolutely. We can become really self-focused and, not really consider what other people or have going on and their viewpoints. Absolutely. Any others? Sometimes there's not empathy. All right, Kira, you pushing. We're going to be there in a minute. People have a tendency to feel entitled. Ooh, you better say that one. Kind of this space of I deserve particular things. And so that leads them to get in a space where they may not be able to offer that kind of golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. There may be barriers such as language or culture. Absolutely. I think too about policy sometimes can keep us from being our best because we have to do things a certain way. I think it should be respectful and treat others the way we want to be treated. You never know when the tables will turn. Absolutely, Ariel. Our society overvalues individualism, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Absolutely, but most of us don't even have boots. Lovely. And then Tiffany said the thing as a case manager, it's sometimes hard to see their perspective when they're treating you with aggression and being passive. Absolutely, Tiffany, that's a really good point. Sometimes it's like you come in like, hey, how can I help you? And then they give off kind of some of this negative or intense aggression. It's natural for us to put up our defenses, right? Because we need to still protect ourselves. And so sometimes that does get entangled. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing. I do appreciate just, being able to hear your feedback. And Mary says the person may not present the real life concern or issue. Absolutely. I don't know how many times this happened to you all. I go through this full assessment. Things are great and lovely. And then, later on they come back needing help. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know this was happening. How did you leave that out? Type deal. And so, it allows us to, we can't help them as much as they're not being transparent and open. Thank you so much for this discussion around that. So again, I think there are lovely models around cultural competence, but I think they really should start at this idea of applying the golden rule and treating others the way that you want to be treated. The other caveat that I will add here, though, I wonder if sometimes it's hard for people to treat people the way they want to be treated if they haven't had good treatment themselves. And so I think about some of the examples that you all just provided. If, clients are being aggressive or, catatonic or some of those things, if they have not had those good experiences, they don't know how to reciprocate that. And so we have to be mindful and share grace around that as well. Linda says, it's hard to be helpful with others when they don't want to help themselves. Absolutely. Because the truth is, I always get the saying messed up, but you take a horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. And I think that's difficult for us because we like to empower people, but understand that there's a difference between this empowerment and then controlling. Absolutely. All right. So I'm gonna keep us moving. Thank you again so much for this going on here. Oh, and sometimes it's generational. Absolutely. If we had time to talk about, in particular, generational curses and how they are just handed down, and without a good level of self-awareness, people just kind of keep with it. Absolutely. So empathy, I've seen it come up a few times. So let's jump into it. So again, remembering where we've come from, we understand that clients are in crises. They likely have some trauma. Those are not our experiences necessarily, although I know some of you may have been where your clients have been, and that's okay too. But the idea is, how do we work with these diverse clients? How do we treat others the way we want to be treated? To me, the answer is empathy. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. More simply put, I look at it as the idea of, putting yourself in someone else's shoes and understanding those shoes may be too big, small, or just the right fit, but just trying to understand or see the view from someone else. If you all have not heard of Brene Brown, she is absolutely amazing. She's like my academic crush. She's also a social worker, but she really looks at this idea around vulnerability, but has a focus on the role of empathy versus sympathy. And if you'll give me just a minute to transition, she has this very nice little short clip, I think it's like 2 minutes or so, that I'm going to try to show to provide an example of the difference between empathy and sympathy. So give me just a second. I'm gonna here. And if you could just let me know if you could see that my screen, hopefully it's like a video, the screen is different.
There is a screen that has come up. Make sure that you've hit optimize for sound in your screen share so we can hear it.
Thank you for that. Oh, maybe I need to do a new share screen. I see what we got going. Okay. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. And then I'm going to try audio.
So what is empathy? And
so I will pause it just to make sure y'all heard that before it all plays.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'll start it back and we'll just do this little quick blurb about Brene Brown introducing what empathy is.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right, give me just a second to get out of this one and get back to my PowerPoint. All right, hopefully we are back and you can see my PowerPoint there.
We are back.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Sorry about that little transition. But I think it's a powerful, powerful video where Brene really talks about kind of this idea of connection versus, sympathy kind of driving. Because the sympathy piece is kind of like, oh, like that happened to you. I'm sorry that happened type deal, where really the empathy calls on us to find something in ourselves and connect with that to be able to connect with someone else. And I think, I talk with folks about building this idea around empathy a lot, but then one of the other questions that comes up is, but I need to have strong boundaries with my, my clients and customers. They don't need to know all my business and all my stuff. And I agree with that, but you can still connect internally with some of those emotions and then act from that space. They don't have to know all of your business or know, that has happened to you or something similar has happened. If you can just connect with that, and really what you're doing in that space is remembering that you're a human being and remember that they're a human being, and then it allows you to kind of connect. So I think on my next slide here, I just have for when you're working in a space with a client, getting back to, the crises are kind of challenging you a little bit, or it's a diverse client and you really don't know much about the background, or you're feeling some kind of way. And then they, kind of are expressing things to you. One thing to do is just to focus on the feeling or the memory versus the issue, especially for you all. You probably work with the same primary issue, the same, whether it's housing or trying to get someone into college, or, like I'm a clinician, so I work a lot with anxiety and depression. And it's really important that I not begin to see my clients as the same, like, oh, this is just depression again, this is just bipolar again. And so that you don't see, oh, this is just another family that needs support, or this is, just those things. And so one way to think about that is to not necessarily focus on the issue, because maybe you have not experienced it yourself, or you haven't experienced it in the way that they did. Or they talk about that judgment piece. You did experience it, but you handled it differently. And so now there's some judgment there. One way to show empathy or connect with your clients and customers is to focus on the feeling or the memory. And here I just have the feelings wheel, but this one just highlights only the negative emotions, because usually that's, around crisis, that's what's kind of there. And so, maybe you haven't had a housing issue, but you've likely been afraid. Maybe you haven't had a substance use issue, but you've been embarrassed. You had anger. You felt alone. You felt disliked or sad. At some point in our lives, we've all felt that way. And again, the goal is not to share, well, let me tell you about this time this happened to me. But we just sometimes in the moment need to focus on that feeling, find it in ourselves, and know, what they're experiencing based on the feeling or a memory, and then be able to reach out and connect with them. And then it's easier, because then what it does sometimes, people are coming to see us at their lowest, and they're looking at us, and, depending on how we're dressed or how we look or our education or the way we speak, they're feeling way up here. But for us, what's really helpful is when we remember that we've had some of those experiences too. It may not be their experience, but I felt angry, I felt afraid, I've been, whatever the issue is. It kind of brings us down. And then when we're here, it's more easy for us to connect and get work done. I hope that's making sense. So just focus on the feeling when you want to connect. You don't really have to focus on the person or the issue. It's really the feeling that's important, because that feeling will drive you to be able to connect. All right. Before I leave the empathy section, are there any questions? Because now I'm going to transition into self-care. Oh, let's see. Maybe I did miss a few comments there. Some folks have been so down on themselves for so long, they have been beaten down by others to the point where they may not feel deserving or help. And they're not deserving of happiness. Absolutely. I think that happens quite a bit, where it's kind of that pattern that people are used to. And so it does make a difference when you come in and you smile, where you come in and you say to them, you know, what do you want to do here? Because they've never been asked that before. And so you do play a very powerful role in helping them to kind of move through that. Okay. So I again want to tell us where we're coming from here. So we've talked about crisis, we've talked about trauma, we've talked about how to work with diverse communities. Just treat people the way you want to be treated, which involves being mindful of what they have going on, but also what you have going on. And then when you're wanting to connect, just apply empathy. How do we do that? By connecting within ourselves, whatever's going on. And then you're able to connect with them. But then next we're going to talk about self-care, which is very important because I know that you all are out there doing very difficult work. I just mentioned you working with people on a daily basis that are in crisis, that have huge trauma loads. And so the work can be taxing. And so we're going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about self-care. So I think, you know, I'll define self-care and then we'll talk about how to look at it. So with self-care here, it's kind of defined as involving levels of awareness and special attention to your personal needs. How often has it been a full day, it's 9 o'clock at night, and you realize you didn't eat, or you realize you didn't take a break, you realize you've been on the go all day? That's not self-care. You have to think about yourself as much as you think about others. So it involves a level of awareness. You have to be mindful, like, oh my gosh, it's 2 p.m. and I haven't had any water today, or it's 2 p.m. and I've been in back-to-back meetings. I haven't had a quiet moment to myself. So it's really about you creating a new level of awareness about what you need and then paying special attention to that. The University of Buffalo School of Social Work found that there are several benefits to self-care. The first is classifying and addressing daily or significant challenges or barriers. It is helpful if you have something that's that you do for self-care that can just be very simple to help you with daily challenges or barriers. It also, as I mentioned, increases self-awareness for you to be like, dang, I ain't doing nothing for myself all week. I was doing for my clients, I was doing for my spouse, my kids, my parents, my friends, but I've done nothing for myself. So it does increase self-awareness when you ask that question around, what did I do for myself today? And then it does help you to live a more balanced life. The truth is you're likely figuring out, especially in the pandemic, you cannot go. And so you really need those breaks in there. So I just kind of like these quick philosophies you've probably heard around self-care, but I think that they are really, really key. The first is kind of this idea, if you've ever flown on an airplane, the first thing they tell you to do is, particularly if you're with a child and, you know, something happens on the plane, what you're supposed to do is put on your airbag first, make sure it's secure, and then you help your child or someone who's younger or someone else. And that's really key. Although it's a child, it's likely your child, you want to take care of them as much as you can. Really, the truth is children are a little more resilient. But if something happens to you, then who will watch out for that child? Who will care for that person? And so it is important that you take care of yourself, put on your mask first, make sure that you're able-bodied and can move forward, and then help someone else. But typically we're in reverse. We're running around putting masks on everybody else, making sure they're safe, and then what's happening to us. The other simple picture there is really just keeping our cup full. If we are very busy handing out, you know, water or cups to other people, who is replenishing us? And yes, you need a support system for that, but some of it you need your own reserves. And so this is a constant conversation we have to have about making sure that your cup is full and that you have on your own mask first before helping others, even your own siblings, family, children. You have to take care of yourself. And I know I'm hopefully preaching to the choir, but just wanted to put it out there. So likely you've heard of, I use a lot of different approaches to self-care and just how to do it. But one that I'd like to share with you today is the idea of using self-care within the 5 love languages. I don't know if you've heard of that, about this related to Gary Chapman's work, but I'm going to show you how to apply self-care within the 5 love languages, because they're pretty simple based on your image there. Yep, you cannot pour from an empty cup. Absolutely. It'll just be dry. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 5 love languages. He has, like, Gary Chapman has a whole set of them related to it, but I'm going to briefly go through them. If you don't mind, I'd love for you to tell me if you do know your love language, and just put it into the chat box. If you were really interested in it, if you go to Gary Chapman's website, there is a free assessment that'll help you determine what your love language is. But essentially, just sit back and think about, what do I enjoy the most? What really helps me to feel whole? Thank you. I see some of them coming in already. And I'll do, for those who may not be as familiar with 5 love languages, I will review it for you just briefly. So don't be all in the gutter around this physical touch one. It's not sexual in nature. This is someone who genuinely really appreciates physical touch. Physical touch is probably one of my secondary ones. And so what that looks like is, if I'm with my husband, I am holding his hand, or I'm stroking his neck. If I'm with my kid, my son has this kind of buzz haircut, I'm like, hey buddy, I'm rubbing his hair. I see my daughter, I do this thing where I rub elbows for some reason, I don't know, but I'm like, hey sweetie, how you doing? Or rubbing her back. And so it's not sexual at all. It's more just about, when you touch or connect physically with people, you feel love. So that's physical touch. Acts of service, this is my mother, which I love the most. Acts of service is when you feel love or show love by acts of service. So my mother, when she comes over to the house, she's like, do you need me to fold clothes? Do you need me to help you with dishes? You know, all that kind of thing. But for her, that's how she shows her love to me, because it's an act of service, doing something for someone else. And so sometimes I was like, dang, Ma, I can, do this stuff myself. I'm an adult. But it helped me to realize that that's how she wants to show me love. And so I'm like, sure, go ahead and do those dishes, mother. So acts of service there. Receiving gifts. Again, receiving gifts is not necessarily linked to money. If you genuinely love receiving gifts, if someone picked up a flower that they just picked out of the yard and brought it to you, that would feel like love. It doesn't have to be expensive diamond rings or, fancy cards or anything. If someone made you a homemade card and brought it to you as a gift, you would think that was really important and special. So that's an example of the love languages for receiving gifts. Quality time, that's my big one. I just love that Netflix and chill idea. I love it. I love just being with people. Even when I'm teaching my class, I realize that's what I love, being in person, because I'm just spending quality time with people. We don't have to do nothing fancy. It just needs to be me and you, focused time. And so that's quality time. And then the last one is words of affirmation. I see this one a lot in my dad. I'd be like, boy, daddy, that grass look good out there. Daddy, you did that thing. Daddy, you fried that chicken real good. And he'd be like, I did, didn't I? And so I realized that for my dad, he really likes words of affirmation. He likes to hear about, the good things that he's doing, or the things that I'm grateful for and appreciate. And so that's his way of showing a love language. So I know I kind of rolled through those, but thank you for adding. It seems like we've got some physical touch and quality timers, words of affirmation, physical touch. Kimberly says she has the book and it really helps you to understand your needs and the needs of your spouse. Absolutely. Absolutely. Is it possible for love languages to change based on the person that it's coming from? Yeah, so I think we change. And so I think it does make sense that our love language will change. But the only caveat that I will give is sometimes it's based on the circumstances. And I'll give you a really good example. When we had just had the twins, as you can imagine, I was pretty stressed and, just had a lot going on trying to figure out how to be a new mom to twins. And my husband would come over and he would be like, oh, rub me, oh, sweetie, it's okay. And I was thinking, if you don't get in there and clean them bottles, acts of service. And so I think it does kind of depend. Like it was great for him to be like, oh, you're okay, honey. But in that moment, I needed an act of service. I needed something else from him to feel loved in that space. And so I think typically you do have these love languages, and for the most part, they stay the same, but we change. And so realizing they can change, and then depending on your situation, you can need something different in the moment. So I hope that does make sense. So in the rest of our time, we're doing pretty good on time. I'm going to just walk you through some basic examples, because I think the thing, especially as we've been in COVID, like, oh, self-care, self-care, it is a lot, but I think it should be basic, because you don't want self-care to just become another thing on your to-do list. Like, oh, I got to go hang out with my girlfriends. Oh, I got to go get a mani and pedi and wait and wear a mask and do all this other stuff, which if those things are muse for you, then good. But I want you to keep it simple, because sometimes we are just doing a lot. And so we just want to do very simple things to show ourselves some love. So I'm going to walk through some of those. So the first one, looking at physical touch, you want to do simple things that just make your body feel good. Something as simple as a soft blanket. Actually, a lot of times I'll keep a soft blanket in the office. And if a client is unloading some stuff and I feel some anxiety or something building up in me, I just begin to stroke my little soft blanket. That's really helpful to kind of help me calm down. Definitely physical activity. So making sure that you're working out, getting in touch with your body, doing a spa day, and it could be something formal, or you can be at home, get you some cucumbers and lay it on back. You know, it doesn't always have to be about money, or swimming, something that's very involved. And so if physical touch is one of your 5 love languages, make sure every day you're showing yourself some love that involves kind of this reminding your body of who you are. Okay. If you found that you really like acts of service, you can do this by doing certain things for yourself that make you feel good. Therapy could apply. Therapy sometimes can be very difficult, but very rewarding when you're putting in the work. And that is an act of service. You went and processed why you had to cuss the person out, or you went and processed why this loss that happened 10 years ago still affects you a certain time of the year. That is an act of service that you're doing for yourself. You're healing. That requires work. You could also do other acts of kindness. I do want to be mindful that, you know, you don't want to be overdoing it for other people. But the truth is, when we do things for other people, it is an act of service for us. We feel some kind of way related to that. Also, cleaning and scheduling, getting organized. I, particularly like on the weekends, will have a set of time where I do a lot of my scheduling and cleaning, because if I don't do that, then the rest of the week is going to be really rough. And so I do look at that as a way of showing myself self-love. If I go ahead and prep my salads, it's more likely I'll eat the salad versus I'll just go get a slice of pizza on campus, right? And so it is an act of service in the way that I'm showing myself love. If you're into receiving gifts, you can do this by treating yourself with things that make you happy. This could be an extravagant trip or something simple. You could think about doing crafts or arts and supplies, investing in yourself, buying comfortable clothes, whatever it may be, where it is these little gifts that you're giving yourself to show yourself some love. So whatever you love, do indulge in it a bit. Quality time. If you're really into, I saw a few folks were into quality time. You can do this by spending time alone, creating certain hobbies, doing things that you love. This could absolutely involve meditation. If you are in the meditation, the greatest app, I came across it a few months ago, is called Insight Timer. Insight Timer is the name of it again, and it's a meditation app. It's free. They have thousands of meditations. They have music on there. It's a lovely app that I actually use every morning to just kind of connect with myself before I get the day going. You could also have some type of creative hobby. Take yourself on dates. It's okay to be out and be the only person in a single space at the movies or at a dinner table. That's okay. We don't need to think about what society's thinking. You need to connect with yourself. And then also just relaxing. Don't take that for granted. Okay. So then I think the last one is the words of affirmation. So it's okay to give yourself pep talks and encourage yourself. We typically call that positive self-talk. Or if you have daily affirmations, I too am personally a journaler, so I journal all the time. Or if you have any particular mantras, these are things, we don't have to wait on other people to say nice things to us. You can say nice things to yourself. You can think nice things, and it does go a long way. So you can show yourself some self-care by, pouring into yourself in a positive manner. And I did just briefly want to share for any of you all that have children, or young people that you love, this can easily be done as well because they have their own love languages. And so just wanted to give you some brief examples there. So for children, if they're into words of affirmation, give compliments like, oh my gosh, I've never seen a 2-year-old jump that high, wow. Use the language of saying I love you if it's appropriate, right? Let a child be able to hear that. Tell them that you're proud. If they're into quality time, make sure that you're reading with them or playing with them, or just simply eating a meal together with no technology. That can go a long way for a child who's into quality time. If you have a child that's acts of service, clean their room. That's my son. When he come home, it's not my favorite thing to do, but if I do like clean his room or do some kind of task that he's supposed to be doing, he come give me the biggest hug, like, oh, mommy, I just love you. But that's really important to him. That makes a big difference. Prepare their favorite meal or organize their stuff. If your kid is more of a physical touch, give them a hug or cuddle in a way that's appropriate, of course. And then if they're about into gifts, pick up something from the dollar store. And that's how you know it's a difference. Like my kids aren't really into gifts. They like, oh, I want this, $100 gift. And I'm like, nah. Kids that really enjoy gifts, if it comes from the dollar store, if it's something homemade or just something small, they really treasure and value it. And so you can do that as well. So we're wrapping up here. So where have we been? What's the summary? I want you to acknowledge that most of the clients will come to you in a state of crisis. Let them define what that crisis is, and then they will likely have some unprocessed trauma. I realize that for a lot of you all, you may not, your specialty may not be mental health, and you do a lot of the referrals piece, but that piece is key. If you notice that there's trauma, or you notice that they're still in crisis and they're struggling to manage, and you make that referral, they may not have been able to do it themselves. And so not taking that for granted. When you see it, being able to acknowledge it for them can be really important. So also you want to inquire about the client's identity and how it defines them, because sometimes that's really important. A lot of times we just kind of have this set plan for how we want to work with the client. But if we didn't stop to ask, how important is your faith? If we didn't stop to ask, do you need to be close to your neighborhood? Is there something special about it? It's something to think through. And then offer empathy. We've all been there before. Just try to connect with the emotion, not necessarily the person or the issue. Just connect with their sadness, connect with their anxiety, connect with whatever they have going on, because we've all likely been there before. And so we can, once we connect with ourselves, we can connect with them. And then lastly, don't forget to show yourself some love. You can do that through the 5 love languages, very simple things you can do every day to make sure that you're showing yourself some love. I just want to say thank you.